The most devastating weapon in human communication is not the word you choose, but the word you deliberately withhold. Everyone is obsessed with articulation, with finding the perfect soundbite, with dominating the airwaves. Yet they miss the ancient, terrifying truth. The loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest. True authority does not need to shout. It does not need to explain itself. The art of silence is the secret architecture of power, an aggressive psychological tool used to dismantle the defenses of the verbose, the anxious, and the desperately eager. We are fundamentally conditioned to fear empty space. We treat a pause as an error, a silence as an obligation to perform. And the moment you recognize this deep-seated fear in others, you have been handed the key to their compliance. My thesis is simple and absolute. Silence is not absence. It is pressure. It is a psychological pressure cooker that forces the opposing party to generate heat, to rush in and fill the void you have expertly manufactured. And in that panicked rush, they will always reveal their hand. They will volunteer information they intended to hide. They will over-explain their motives. They will confess to the unspoken crimes they fear you already suspect. This is not about introversion or shyness. This is about the strategic deployment of absence, transforming yourself from an active participant into a silent, immovable judge. If you are tired of the shallow noise that passes for wisdom and are ready to confront the uncomfortable machinery of human influence, subscribe right now. Don't miss the next stage of this analysis. Consider the dynamic shift that occurs the moment you deliberately refuse to engage in the expected verbal dance. When two people meet, society dictates a reciprocal flow. A question is met with an answer, a statement with a rebuttal. When you break that expected circuit, when you simply absorb the input and offer only the crushing weight of your observation, the conversational flow collapses, and the other person is suddenly alone on stage. They are performing for an audience that offers no applause, no critique, only impenetrable neutrality. This forces them into a loop of agonizing self-questioning. Did I say the wrong thing? Do they know something I don't? Are they judging me? The silent person becomes the repository of all fears, the blank screen onto which every insecurity and assumption is projected. The speaker assumes that your silence means understanding, or deep disapproval, or superior knowledge. They will begin arguing with the version of you they have constructed in their mind, not the physical person sitting across from them. Your greatest advantage is that you know nothing, yet they believe you know everything. This gap between their desperate need for validation and your chilling refusal to grant it is where genuine power resides. The moment you speak, you become mortal again. You offer a data point, an opinion, and thus a weakness they can target. The longer you hold the silence, the more divine, the more terrifying you become. The ultimate irony is that most people believe they are winning when they are talking. They conflate verbosity with victory. But the person who talks is expending energy, revealing resource allocation, broadcasting their vulnerabilities, and committing themselves to a specific position that can later be exploited. The silent master is conserving every resource. They are listening for the subtle shifts in tone, the concealed motives buried between the lines, the tells that betray the speaker's true desperation. Silence is pure intelligence gathering. It is the sophisticated reconnaissance mission conducted while the enemy believes they are simply having a conversation. Never underestimate the profound desperation of the human ego to be seen, to be confirmed. And never forget that the refusal to grant that confirmation is a controlled demolition of the will. The suffering stems from an ancient, foundational fragility. The human self is not an immutable structure, but a constantly negotiated social contract. We are not born with an internal confirmation that we exist or that our beliefs are correct. We rely on the collective mirror of society to reflect a stable, recognizable image back to us. We talk, and the listener nods, affirming that the sound we made was indeed language, that the thought expressed was indeed intelligible, and that the person speaking is indeed worthy of attention. This is the crucial, daily maintenance of the ego, the small transactional confirmations that prove we haven't vanished into the ontological ether. Silence, the calculated refusal to provide that reflection, is the psychological equivalent of pulling the plug on the life support of their identity. It sends them spiraling into ontological insecurity. The speaker is suddenly forced to ask, is my reality contingent entirely upon external validation? And if the silent person refuses to validate it, am I, right now, functionally non-existent? They don't just fear judgment, they fear non-existence. They are talking to keep themselves anchored to reality, and you, the silent observer, are simply allowing the anchor line to drift. Most individuals operate under the delusion that their identity is solid, inherent, and self-contained. The sudden introduction of silence exposes the terrifying truth. The self is a fragile, collaborative fiction, easily undermined by a simple withholding of attention. This is a truth most psychology glosses over, preferring comforting platitudes to functional darkness. If you find value in these relentless dives into the gears of human motivation, hit that subscribe button now. Don't miss the essential truths that are kept quiet for a reason. The agony of the speaker is directly proportional to their need to monetize their thoughts, to trade their internal narrative for external validation. They are accustomed to the rapid marketplace of discourse, where every statement is instantly processed, liked, or refuted, generating immediate feedback, however shallow. Silence disrupts the entire transaction. It says, your currency is worthless here. It forces them to consume their own words, to hear their arguments not as a performance for an audience, but as a soliloquy in an empty room. This self-consumption is intensely painful because it brings them face to face with the quality of their own unedited thought, a territory most people aggressively avoid. They realize, with sudden, sickening clarity, that they were talking simply to hear noise, not to convey meaning. They were filling a void in themselves, and the refusal to help them fill it makes the vacuum absolute. Silence is powerful because it is the ultimate disruption of expectation. In the modern age, we have been conditioned by the algorithms of instant response and the dopamine hit of immediate acknowledgement. A text left on read causes genuine anxiety. A conversational pause of more than 3 seconds is interpreted as hostility or profound error. To sit in sustained, intentional quiet is an act of radical rebellion against the social mandate for instantaneous, surface-level engagement. It weaponizes the listener's attention by making it finite and precious. You are not listening. You are evaluating. You are not waiting for an opportunity to interject. You are waiting for the confession. Every passing second of unacknowledged speech drains their confidence, forcing them to escalate the drama, to reveal a deeper layer of vulnerability, hoping that this revelation, this desperate plea, will finally break your impenetrable facade. But the master of silence knows that the more they reveal, the weaker they become. True power lies not in knowing what to say, but in understanding precisely what you do not need to say. The person confronted by intentional silence immediately understands the game, even if they cannot name the rules. They are being asked to provide the total capital for the conversation. Their response, therefore, is not genuine insight, but a panicked, escalating attempt to break the dam of your attention and get the flow going again. Any flow. They accelerate their speech, adding qualifiers, piling on anecdotes, introducing irrelevant complexity, or manufacturing outrage, all in a desperate attempt to create enough noise to drown out the simple, terrifying fact that they are talking to themselves. This verbal spray, this frantic production of meaningless data, is the psychological equivalent of a child shouting, "Look at me!" in a crowded room. It proves the very point the silence was making. They mistake activity for meaning, and their core identity is dependent upon your ratification of their performance. They are terrified of being caught in the act of being inarticulate. If you find this dissection of modern power dynamics both unsettling and absolutely vital, understand that we specialize in dragging these truths out of the dark. Make sure you hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next deep dive into the invisible mechanics governing our lives. This mechanism is never clearer than when silence is deployed against the professional liar. The politician, the corporate executive, or the influencer whose livelihood depends on the speed and plausibility of their narrative. Consider the high-stakes political interview, where the subject is asked a single, precise question regarding a demonstrable failure, such as, "Did you knowingly mislead the public about the cost of the project?" The prepared answer is a dense, 3-minute speech covering policy context, future vision, and historical precedent. Everything except the cost. The interviewer, if they are a true master of the psychological leverage, does not interrupt. They simply wait. They hold the stare. They do not shuffle papers. They do not adjust the microphone. They do not even offer the slightest nod of acknowledgement. The politician finishes their exhaustive, rehearsed defense. And then comes the silence. It lasts maybe 5 seconds, which in the artificial reality of broadcast media is an eternity. A black hole of unedited reality. The politician is now faced with the dreadful vacuum. They have exhausted their script. They have burned their strongest evasion tactic. The question remains hanging in the air, heavy, untouched, and magnified by the quiet. What do? They repeat the defense, often stumbling, adding new and contradictory details, because the psychological compulsion to fill the space is greater than the need to maintain a coherent narrative. They are no longer speaking to the audience. They are speaking to the silence itself, pleading with it to relent. They begin to unravel their own manufactured reality, revealing the loose threads of their lie, not because they are being shouted down, but because the stillness has forced them into a state of self-betrayal. The profound cruelty of this tactic is that it bypasses the intellect entirely and aims for the deep, primate panic of social isolation. When you speak, you expect resonance. It's a biological mandate for belonging. Silence is non-response, which is perceived by the psyche as the threat of expulsion. It implies that what you have offered is not even worth the effort of refutation. It's below the threshold of serious engagement. This is how silence functions as a perfect mirror. The desperate speaker sees their own fear reflected back, magnified 10 times over. They see the naked inadequacy of their current offering, and they panic, stripping away layer after layer of defense until the listener is staring directly at the raw, unprocessed motive. The silence of the auditor doesn't just judge the words, it judges the intent behind them. It asks, why did you really need to say that? What fragile internal wound were you trying to bandage with this noise? And because most people haven't truly interrogated their own motives in decades, the realization of their own shallow intent is crippling. They weren't seeking resolution. They were soliciting applause. Silence denies the applause, and therefore, it denies the identity built upon it. This is why the modern, noise-addicted individual finds sustained silence utterly unbearable. It is the sound of their own infrastructure crumbling. And this infrastructure crumbling is precisely why modern society has engineered a mandatory escape route: the incessant, sanctified noise of performative vulnerability. The grand, cynical lie we are told today is that silence equals repression, and that the only path to authenticity is immediate, televised confession. We have been conditioned to believe that courage is synonymous with broadcasting your trauma, that self-discovery means streaming your existential crisis, and that the only way to be real is to be perpetually emotionally available and unprocessed for public consumption. This is not vulnerability. It is exhibitionism repurposed as a social currency. It's a mechanism designed to preempt the judgment of silence by filling the atmosphere with so much preemptive noise that genuine introspection becomes impossible. We are trading the painful, necessary work of self-consolidation for the cheap, addictive hit of social validation. When you immediately externalize every thought and feeling, you are not being honest. You are simply outsourcing your sense of self-worth. You are demanding that the crowd finish your sentence, that they affirm the structure of your internal chaos, thereby allowing you to avoid the terrifying burden of organizing it yourself. This is the ultimate evasion, confusing the act of sharing a problem with the act of solving it. True integration, the kind that produces wisdom instead of mere data, requires a sustained, adversarial period of silence where the self must wrestle with its own reflection without the soothing balm of external noise. We don't want to wrestle. We want witnesses. We want our fragility to be validated by strangers, transforming our wounds from private liabilities into public assets. But if this analysis feels too cold, too close to the uncomfortable truth you have perhaps been avoiding, then you understand why this kind of depth is increasingly rare on a platform saturated with the noise of surface-level self-help. If you value thought that doesn't just skim the emotional surface, but actively dives into the corrosive depths of human psychology, then ensure you are subscribed now. It is the only way this quiet counter-narrative can persist against the roar of the consensus, because the true strength lies not in the capacity to speak, but in the deliberate capacity to withhold. The person who is secure in their motives does not rush to defend themselves against the void. They let the accusation hang, knowing that their silence acts as a filter, separating the audience into two groups: those who are desperate for a response and those who possess the maturity to sit with ambiguity. The frantic speaker, obsessed with control, throws words like sandbags against the rising tide of doubt, desperate to manage the external perception. The secure individual, however, recognizes that silence is the highest form of communication control. It is a powerful refusal to play the game according to the opponent's rules. It is an act of total self-possession that says, "My internal coherence is not dependent on your immediate affirmation, and therefore, I do not owe you a performance." This refusal to perform is what truly breaks the will of the interrogator or the gossip. It strips them of the energy they need, because that energy is always borrowed from the victim's expected defensive reaction. When the expected reaction fails to materialize, the accuser finds their own energy collapsing inward, leaving them sputtering alone in the echo chamber of their own noise. But if silence is such a definitive psychological weapon, why is it so rarely employed? Because the refusal to perform externally demands a terrifying performance internally. We are terrified not of the silence itself, but of the void it reveals. The modern psyche is not designed for stillness. It is engineered for constant input, designed to fear the moment when the defenses drop and the true, unvarnished self stands alone, devoid of the social mirroring that confirms its existence. We are not afraid of what others think of us when we are silent. We are terrified of what we are forced to think of ourselves when the external noise finally ceases. That stillness forces a confrontation with the true, raw architecture of the self, revealing the hypocrisies and compromises we have neatly buried under the avalanche of productivity and external validation. The immediate, frantic need to speak, to justify, to broadcast, is merely an advanced form of psychological avoidance. It is the ego's desperate attempt to keep the internal critic muffled by the sheer volume of external engagement. We mistake the ability to generate noise for the ability to generate meaning, and thus we flee the solitude where meaning is actually forged. The person addicted to response, obsessed with the immediate reply button, is not communicating. They are soothing a fundamental existential anxiety. Noise is cheap existential aspirin. It is the perfect anesthetic for the fear of contingency. The deeply unsettling awareness that we are fundamentally alone in defining our own values and meaning. Every notification, every defensive statement, every rushed explanation is a momentary shield against the ultimate truth that the self, stripped bare of performance and audience, must face the ultimate, defining questions entirely on its own. It is easier, infinitely easier, to manage the superficial narrative than to address the profound lack of internal coherence, the lack of true sovereignty that underlies the frantic need for affirmation. It is easier to be loud and externally validated than to be quiet and internally solid. This level of psychological diagnosis, the kind that insists on identifying the illness behind the chosen anesthetic, is difficult to maintain. Most platforms prefer to treat the symptom, offering feel-good affirmations that keep the audience medicated and compliant. If you believe this kind of ruthless, clinical analysis of the self, the kind that cuts past comfort to reach genuine insight and challenges the fundamental assumptions of modern anxiety, is necessary, and if you want to ensure this ongoing, difficult investigation into the hidden structures of the mind continues unobstructed, then please take a moment to hit that subscribe button right now. Your active support is the only metric that matters in keeping the signal clear and the analysis deep. Because those who cannot tolerate the void eventually forfeit the ability to command their own psychological space. They become human relays, merely echoing the latest perceived mandate of culture or the immediate expectation of the social sphere, precisely because their internal monologue has atrophied. They have outsourced their identity to the collective. They are never truly present, they are only ever reacting. True mastery, therefore, begins with the capacity to sit in the unedited, silent space, understanding that the only performance that ever truly mattered was the one directed inward, evaluating the motive and the consequence without the soothing balm of external applause. It is the practice of becoming utterly immune to the fear of being misunderstood, because you have achieved a clarity of purpose that transcends the necessity of being understood at all. This internal insulation is not a retreat. It is the ultimate psychological armor, because the greatest vulnerability is not poverty or physical threat, but the sudden, absolute reliance on manufactured external meaning. Watch the high-status public figure, the titan of industry, the celebrated creative, the political ideologue, when the consensus turns. They possess infinite resources, they command the attention of millions, yet they shatter completely at the moment of external withdrawal. Why? Because they outsourced the foundation of their worth to the very market that eventually turned against them. Their identity was a publicly traded commodity. When the stock crashed, the self filed for existential bankruptcy. They mistook the echo chamber for the soul. The panic you witness in the aftermath of a public shaming or career collapse is not merely the fear of losing money or access. It is the sheer terror of existential evaporation. The question they face, entirely unprepared, is, who am I when I am no longer what I do? The answer, terrifyingly often, is that they are nothing at all. They spent decades perfecting the facade, and now, standing in the rubble of their reputation, they realize the facade was the only thing holding up the sky. This is the profound clinical cost of valuing affirmation over architecture. They mastered the external performance and neglected the internal physics. If you find this kind of challenging, unsparing dissection of the self and society essential, if you agree that the most vital knowledge is often the most uncomfortable, then please consider subscribing and liking this video. It is your commitment that guarantees the continuation of these deep dives into the difficult truths that other channels refuse to touch. We must remember that external applause, no matter how deafening, cannot drown out the internal silence of a life lived by proxy. And this is where the modern contagion truly spreads. Through the systemic refusal to tolerate ambiguity. We crave certainty like a drug, demanding simple, digestible narratives that explain the world and, more importantly, explain us to ourselves. We seek the neat closure that life simply refuses to offer, and we punish those, be they artists, philosophers, or analysts, who insist on maintaining the complexity. The demand for simple answers is merely the psychological signature of a generation that has been trained to believe that the world owes them frictionless clarity. True maturity, conversely, is the deep, quiet acceptance that coherence is a project, not a given state, and that the most powerful truths are almost always paradoxical, residing somewhere in the tension between two irreconcilable facts. Those who cannot tolerate paradox eventually default to dogma, choosing the easy rigidity of a tribe over the fluid, exhausting freedom of individual thought. This is why intellectual honesty is becoming so rare. It requires admitting the limits of your current understanding, a vulnerability that the culture of instant expertise simply cannot afford. And this toxic simplification is never more apparent than in the modern, utterly corrosive doctrine of the authentic self. We are constantly bombarded with the mandate to find ourselves, as if the true self were a prepackaged commodity waiting to be uncovered beneath layers of societal grime, a perfect diamond waiting in the mud. This is perhaps the greatest lie sold to the psychologically immature, the idea that identity is an act of discovery rather than an act of creation. The search for the authentic self is, for most people, merely a highly comfortable form of inaction. It is a narcissistic treadmill that allows one to indefinitely postpone the hard, painful work of defining oneself through commitment, sacrifice, and action in the real world. They spend years performing elaborate internal archaeology, digging for some essential, static truth about who they are, only to find that the self is not a noun at all. It is a verb. It is not an innate characteristic. It is the summary record of your choices, especially those choices made under duress and uncertainty. The person who claims to be searching for their identity is often simply paralyzed by the fear that if they commit to a definition, they might fail to live up to it. Or worse, they might accidentally choose the wrong mask. The paradox, however, is brutal. You only discover who you truly are in the process of committing to who you are trying to be. The authentic self is the shadow cast by your intentional behavior, not the light source of your feelings. To be authentic is not to be emotionally transparent. It is to align your external actions with your internal, hard-won values, even when that alignment costs you comfort, status, or social approval. The modern cultural obsession, conversely, encourages a performative authenticity, a curated biography designed to signal uniqueness while conforming perfectly to the latest tribal expectations of nonconformity. It is the sophisticated camouflage of the deeply conventional mind. If you find yourself nodding along to this diagnosis, recognizing the profound psychological comfort in these painful truths, and if you believe that challenging the sacred cows of modern thought is necessary for intellectual progress, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Your engagement is the only metric that sustains this kind of deep, uncompromised analysis against the tide of feel-good noise and shallow consensus. We must look closely at how this search for an easy authenticity feeds directly into the performance trap. By seeking a ready-made identity, we inadvertently invite the world to judge the quality of our discovery. We are not judged on the integrity of our construction, but on the marketability of our self-image. The result is a population constantly adjusting their psychological architecture based on feedback loops, always trying to optimize the narrative of their journey, instead of simply building the structure that makes the journey worthwhile. They confuse self-expression, which is easy and often meaningless, with self-actualization, which is difficult and absolutely vital. Self-expression requires only an audience. Self-actualization requires discipline and a profound indifference to the audience's reaction. This is the difference between writing a journal entry and carving a stone monument. One is ephemeral venting. The other is a permanent physical commitment to an ideal. We are currently drowning in a culture that rewards the journal entry and actively punishes the construction of monuments, largely because a monument stands defiant, refusing to be edited or deleted based on the day's changing opinions. The intolerance for paradox and the craving for simplicity therefore manifest as a mass preference for the temporary and the revocable. Everything must be subject to revision, every commitment treated as a phase, because true commitment, the kind that defines character, necessarily limits future options, and modern identity has become obsessed with maintaining infinite optionality. This psychological gravity towards the center of least resistance ensures mediocrity. It ensures that the majority of minds will settle for the prescribed certainty of their chosen group, believing they have achieved freedom simply because they have exchanged one comfortable cage for another. The ultimate lie is that you can build a stable life on an unstable foundation of provisional choices. The truth is that character is forged in the fire of non-negotiable definition. You are not defined by what you feel you could be, but by what you absolutely refuse to stop being. The psychological gravity towards the center of least resistance ensures mediocrity. It ensures that the majority of minds will settle for the prescribed certainty of their chosen group, believing they have achieved freedom simply because they have exchanged one comfortable cage for another. The ultimate lie is that you can build a stable life on an unstable foundation of provisional choices. The truth is that character is forged in the fire of non-negotiable definition. You are not defined by what you feel you could be, but by what you absolutely refuse to stop being. The final verdict, the inescapable conclusion of this psychological age, is that we have mistaken flexibility for resilience. We believe that by keeping all doors open, we remain free. But in reality, we have become paralyzed by potential. The ultimate freedom is not the absence of limits, but the courageous acceptance of defining limits. We must finally accept that the self-worth knowing, the self-worth becoming, is the one that has consciously burned its own bridges, refusing the easy escape route back to optionality. You must stop treating your life as a rough draft perpetually awaiting editorial feedback. It is time to abandon the ephemeral journal entry and pick up the chisel. The world does not need another perfectly curated highlight reel. It needs hard proof of conviction. It needs monuments. Your character is the last monument you have left to build in an age obsessed with demolition. It must stand, unyielding, even when the mob demands its collapse. This is the only path to escaping the suffocating consensus of the provisional mind. This is the definition of courage. To build something so defined, so committed, that it cannot be revoked. If you believe that life requires carving, not customizing, and if you are ready to join the few who still prioritize definition over optionality, then subscribe now. We are building the intellectual foundation for those who refuse to be edited. Join the community dedicated to the non-negotiable truth. The final, terrifying verdict is that true freedom is earned through subtraction, not addition. You achieve peace not by multiplying options, but by eliminating everything that is not essential to your core purpose. Stop whispering your intentions. Shout your commitments. The greatest tragedy is not failure, but the lifelong ambiguity that prevents you from even knowing whether you succeeded or failed, because you never fully committed to the metric. Your monument demands the burning of the escape routes. If you are tired of living in the gray area and are ready to stand firm in the certainty of your own making, join this community. Subscribe now and become one of the immovable.